Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and right now we're going to be listening to not one, but two microphones. Right in front of me right now, I'm speaking into a JZ Amethyst microphone. If you've been following this channel, you've probably heard me speak on this one before because I'm using this in pretty much every episode of the podcast, pretty much every demonstration video I do. I've switched over from using a lavalier mic for some demonstration videos and a SM7 for the podcast to using this on pretty much everything. I did a kind of shootout video with this and another JZ microphone called the Black Hole. You can check that one out too. And today I'm putting it up against a different JZ microphone called the Vintage 67. And this is interesting because a lot of people actually ask me questions about this when they ask me, hey, the voice sounds great. What mic are you using? And I tell them the Amethyst. One of the first questions they ask is, have you tried the Vintage 67? How do they compare? And my answer has usually been, I don't know, because until now, I'd never been in the room with a Vintage 67 before. They're supposed to sound pretty similar to one another. Do they? Just how similar do they sound? Are they basically identical? We're going to discover that today. We'll look at the frequency response charts for both of these microphones. We'll hear them in action, not only on my voice, but on some instruments as well. Let's dive right into it. All right, first, a tiny bit of background. Well, first, I'm actually going to put up my pop filter. People often ask about this too. Who'd you get this pop filter from? This nice little small profile pop filter is actually made by JZ microphones. It's an all metal aluminum design. I like it because it's kind of small. It doesn't take up a lot of space. When I'm using this thing on camera, I definitely prefer it to one of those much bigger, sock style microphones. And it is a kind of aluminum mesh, which is supposed to be better for letting high frequencies through while still blocking plosives and all of that. I've gotten pretty good at speaking on these mics without getting plosives. If I'm going to be using a lot of P's, I'll often just kind of turn all off axis, and that seems to do it. And that's one of the things I've actually liked about this microphone, the Amethyst, is how good it sounds off axis. There's a lot of videos lately where you'll be seeing me and you don't even see a mic in the shot, but it sounds pretty good. That's often because I have the microphone down here around my chest, just below the shot, and it can be kind of just out of the shot, and it still sounds pretty darn good, just like I'm talking kind of right into it. I get a little bit more room sound that way, but it really doesn't seem to hurt me at all. There's enough treatment up on the room that any reflections I'm getting are pretty minimal and pretty decent sounding. All right, now I've been talking fairly off axis on this mic. I'm going to kind of go up a little closer to it so you can see how full, how bottom heavy it starts to sound as I get up closer. So this is the sound of the JZ Amethyst microphone. If I was going to use it in a little bit more of a voiceover kind of way, if I was going to be speaking right into it in kind of radio format or, doing audiobooks or whatever, or even a lot of singers might speak into it this close. And one of the potential issues and potential pluses of this microphone is it actually gets a really nice, big, blossoming low end. There's a really kind of enhanced proximity effect that isn't unwieldy, but is really full. And I do find myself on occasion brightening up this mic a little bit for some of the spoken word stuff I do, just rolling off a tiny bit of low end. But I like that it has a big, rich bottom, a clear but not kind of grating or annoying top end. It's like smooth and clean. And if I want it to be less bottomy, it's really easy to just roll off a little bit of the bottom end. And now I want to hear how this Vintage 67 compares. So let's switch right over. I'm going to start talking into it, and I'll talk a little bit more about their line. All right, so now I'm on the Vintage 67, this time without a pop filter. And to be honest, these two mics should be almost identical. I was looking at their frequency response charts and their spec sheets, and they're practically the same on paper. Do they sound the same? Well, to be honest, right now I haven't even listened to them yet, so you're going to have to tell me. I'm going to listen back to them myself, and maybe we'll compare notes. But as I'm talking into this V67, let's go over here to the technical specs. Right now, I'm looking at the technical specs for the Vintage 67. Here is the frequency response chart and the polar pattern. And now I'm going to switch over to the same thing for the Amethyst. And lo and behold, it looks basically the same. We're seeing this is probably the same image for both of these frequency response charts when I click between them. So what we see happening here is a little bit of a rise up below 200 hertz, with the most significant rise up being between something like 40 and 100 hertz. So there is a little bit of a low bump kind of going up, and then below 30 it rolls off very, very slightly until we get down to 20, where there's a little more roll off. And then there's a little bit of presence added a little lift starting around 2K that kind of tapers off by 8K. And this lift is centered around 5K, but also boosting the surrounding frequencies. Exactly how much? Well, this chart doesn't quite say, but my guess is that between 1 to I doubt it would be 3 dB, maybe more than 1 dB in some of these areas, and it does give it a little bit of a character. And then above 10K, maybe something like 12K and up, there's a little bit of a gentle roll-off. So this puts the mic kind of in the style of U67-ish, maybe old U87 kind of, solid statey U67. I'd say that the actual U67s that I've encountered in the wild, actual tube ones, original ones, are often going to sound a little bit darker than these microphones. And with the tubes inside of them, when you push them harder, there can be a little bit of a kind of breakup that you might not get out of a solid state microphone. But I still totally get what they're going for, it being in that same family of a slightly cleaner, more modern version of a U67. And I would imagine that if you got a new U67 off the shelf when they were first made decades upon decades ago, it wouldn't sound like a U67 today in 2020. A U67 made in the 1960s, 60 years prior, probably isn't going to sound the same as one that's aged 60 years and probably sounds significantly darker than it would have off the shelf. So maybe in some ways this might sound closer to a factory fresh original U67, although that comparison is going to be near impossible for me to directly make. Although if you have a line on how I could make that direct comparison, I have my gears turning on it right now. It might be interesting to check out. But it does look like the two mics are practically identical in their frequency response, at least on paper. And here, when I go into the technical specs and I look at everything, it's basically the same. The Amethyst here shows a noise level of 7 dB. And here on the Vintage 67, it shows a noise level of 6 dB, so that's 1 dB different. When I look at the max SPL handling for both, it both says 134. Dynamic range, the Amethyst says 127, the Vintage 67 says 128, 1 dB difference. I don't know if that's a difference you could actually perceive, or if it's a difference that's even there. But I believe the capsule designs for these are pretty much as close to identical as you can get, and they really are close to being almost the same mic in a different body with maybe some slightly different electronics, but the capsule design being in the same here. There are some differences. The price point between these two guys is basically the same if you're shopping around for them, but there are some differences, most notably in the mounting and body design. So the Amethyst, in a way, is a little bit lower profile. I'll talk into the Amethyst now. It takes up a little bit less space. To make it fair, I'll take away the pop filter. It takes up a little bit less space, a little bit lower profile, and it has the option to add on a shock mount. That's what these little rings are here for. So that's kind of a nice feature that you could add on a shock mount to this mic. But if you're not adding on a shock mount, my one complaint about this microphone is that the connector here for where it goes onto the stand isn't very flexible. It pretty much goes straight up and down. You can't adjust it in too many ways. The Vintage 67, on the other hand, if you're not using some kind of shock mount with it, it has this ability to have this ball and socket adjustment. And I'll talk into the Amethyst now so I can adjust it without you hearing a whole bunch of noise. But I can kind of loosen this ball and socket adjustment here, and it allows me to rotate it in a much wider range of motion than there's no range of motion on the Amethyst, but this one you can get a nice range of motion out of. So I kind of like that. That's a cool design feature. So I'll talk into the Vintage 67 again now. That is one of the nice things about the Vintage 67 is that you have this kind of swiveling attachment built in. So even without adding on a shock mount, there's just a little bit more flexibility in how you can position the mic that you don't have with the Amethyst. On the Amethyst, you do have the option of adding on this shock mount for roughly $100 or 100 euros here. It is nice to have that option to add on a shock mount. And the shock mount does give you a little bit of additional flexibility on the Amethyst as far as positioning goes, but it's not going to come that way right out of the box and you're adding on $100 to get that out of the Amethyst. So let's go back and forth just a little bit more on my voice here. I'm going to swallow the mic again, and here are the proximity effect changes between the two. Again, basically same capsule here, slightly different electronics. Are we going to hear a difference? You be the judge and let me know what you think. So here's the V67. Again, me speaking directly into it. I'm going to try to control my P's and B's so that we don't get any plosives on it. But this is the sound of the V67 with me right on it. And here's the sound of the Amethyst with me speaking right into it, both of them JZ microphones. I'm going to back off a little bit more now, and I might speak in a much further distance, something like this in a lot of the videos that I do, or even further. So this is the sound of the Amethyst at a further distance, and a lot of more natural singers might sing from this kind of range. And then here's the sound of that vintage 67 from further away. I'd also be curious to know if these headbasket designs that are different have any effect on the sound and any effect in the off-axis tonality. So now, although it looks like I'm speaking to the vintage 67, I'm going to switch into hearing me on the Amethyst off-axis. And I'll boost up the level so we can hear the difference here. And now I'm going to do the opposite. I'll boost up these levels so they're basically the same in post. Now it looks like I'm speaking into the Amethyst, but I'm switching to the vintage 67, and you're hearing me actually talking through this microphone off-axis. So I'd be curious to hear how those sound different or the same. So what's your vote based on spoken word? Remember to hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments down below. Are you hearing a difference in my voice off of the Amethyst and the JZ Vintage 67? Do you have a preferred one? Do they sound pretty much indistinguishable? Let me know. And let's finish off this test by hearing both this Amethyst and this Vintage 67 on some real instruments. Tell me what you think. All right, so I have a little admission of guilt to make. I have not played guitar since the last time I did one of these mic demonstration videos. And before that, I hadn't played guitar for 10 years. So let's see if I still remember how to play. Okay, so now that we've heard these mics, what do I think? And more importantly, what do you think? Well, I'll give you my quick tasting notes. To me, when I was listening to these, in each of the examples, I'm getting just a tiny bit more clarity, top-end definition openness out of the Vintage 67 compared to the Amethyst. It seems to have just a slightly more open, airy top end, slightly more controlled low end, and maybe slightly faster, better transient response out of the Vintage 67 compared to the Amethyst, where the Amethyst seems just slightly silkier, smoother, darker on top, slightly fuller on the bottom. And since they basically have the same capsule here, these differences would probably be owing to slight variations in the difference of the headbasket design and maybe some of the internal circuitry inside of the mic. It's really subtle, and I like both of them. I am thinking about switching over now for all of my podcasts and my demonstration videos to this one. Maybe it's a grass is always greener on the other side thing. Another factor that it could be is just that this mic just came out of the box. It doesn't have any months upon months worth of, dust and other things potentially getting on the capsule. So that could be a difference as well. Do you think you hear a difference? You let me know down in the comments below. Tell me which one you prefer. All right, thanks for joining me while I try out this Vintage 67 and this Amethyst, both from JZ Microphones. This has been my daily microphone for my podcast and my demonstration videos. Let me know, should it continue to be the one, or should I be switching over to this Amethyst Vintage 67? Let me know if you hear a difference. Basically the same capsule design, but we may hear subtle differences from the slightly different electronics inside the bodies, as well as the slightly different head basket designs that can potentially have an impact on tone. This has been the Amethyst from JZ and the Vintage 67 from JZ. Now, if you're interested in either of these mics for yourself, we are doing a giveaway right now. Go to SonicScoop.com/contest. That's SonicScoop.com/contest, where you can enter to win this Vintage 67 completely for free, thanks to our friends at JZ Microphones. Also, another thing that's going on is that maybe once or twice a year, you'll get the option to buy either of these microphones at a severely reduced price. Sometimes JZ does some pretty significant sales on these kinds of microphones, and with holidays coming up, who knows, that could happen soon. So if you sign up for the SonicScoop newsletter, go to SonicScoop.com, go sign up for the newsletter and the little red button in the upper right-hand side, and we'll keep you posted. If we see these going on sale again, we'll definitely let you know about it. Thanks again to our friends at JZ Microphones for sending me both these mics to check out. They've been longtime sponsors and friends of the channel. I really do like the mics, so I use them on every video. If I didn't like the mics, I wouldn't be using them on every video. And this Amethyst has replaced my SM7 as my go-to mic on all the videos. So I do like the stuff. I think they're some of the best bang for the buck condenser mics out there. These haven't given me a lick of trouble. They've been solidly well built. And if you want to check out more videos where I use both of these, I'll put those down in the show notes below. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop talking to you through a JZ Vintage 67 microphone and a JZ Amethyst microphone. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.